Don't tell me he's fine, look at his hand. Suga's voice cracked through the narrow backstage corridor, sharp enough to silence everyone around him. Jimin sat against the wall beneath the harsh white lights, his injured hand held tightly against his chest, his face unusually pale. A staff member froze with a towel in his hands. Somewhere beyond the curtain, thousands of fans were still chanting, unaware that something had gone terribly wrong only seconds earlier. Suga dropped to his knees beside Jimin, trying to steady his breathing, but tears were already running down his face. "Hyung, please," Jimin whispered, attempting a weak smile. Then Jungkook appeared at the end of the corridor, and the expression on his face made everyone stop talking. What had Jungkook just discovered that could make Suga break down like this? And was Jimin's injury really the reason everyone was suddenly afraid? What do you think? Was Suga crying only because Jimin was hurt, or was there something deeper happening behind the scenes? Tell us whose side you would take. The concert had reached the moment when the entire arena seemed to move with the music. Thousands of light sticks swayed like a field of stars while Jimin crossed the stage beneath a wash of white and violet lights, his breathing becoming heavier after the previous performance. From the side of the stage, Suga watched him between cues, noticing something most people in the audience could not see. Jimin had briefly flexed his fingers before gripping the microphone again. It lasted less than a second, so Suga said nothing. The next song began, louder and faster, and Jimin forced himself back into the choreography. His smile returned as the camera followed him across the extended stage. Then, during a sharp turn near the front platform, his foot landed awkwardly. Jimin tried to recover, but his balance disappeared. His body dropped hard onto the stage. The music continued for several beats before the nearest dancers realized something was wrong. Jimin immediately tried to push himself upright, but one hand remained pressed against the floor while the other instinctively moved toward his wrist. The giant screen still showed his face, and the audience began to murmur as the choreography around him broke apart. Suga saw it from across the stage. He stopped moving. For one brief moment, the performer disappeared behind the professional instinct of the person who had known Jimin long enough to recognize when a smile was hiding pain. Suga stepped toward him, but Jimin shook his head almost imperceptibly, silently asking him to continue. The band kept playing, yet the atmosphere had changed. Jimin stood again, refusing the offered hand from a dancer, and lifted his microphone as though nothing had happened. But when he raised his injured hand, his fingers trembled. Suga noticed. And this time, he could no longer pretend he hadn't. What Jimin was trying to hide beneath the stage lights was only beginning to become clear. The curtain, the noise of the arena became strangely distant. Jimin had made it through the end of the song, but the moment he stepped off the stage, his posture changed. The smile disappeared. He lowered his injured hand and held it close to his body while a staff member approached with a worried expression. "Jimin, let me see it." Jimin hesitated. "After the next song," he said quietly. "I can still go back." The staff member looked toward the stage, then back at him. "You just fell." Jimin nodded as if that detail barely mattered. "I know." What mattered to him was the schedule. The concert had been rehearsed for weeks, every transition timed to the second, and thousands of people were waiting on the other side of the curtain. He glanced toward the monitor where the next performance was already beginning. Suga stood several meters away, watching without saying anything. He had seen Jimin fall. He had also seen the way Jimin tried to hide the pain afterward. "Show me your hand," Suga finally said. Jimin looked up. "Hyung, it's probably nothing. I didn't ask what you think it is." The words were calm, but Suga's expression wasn't. Jimin slowly extended his hand. There was already swelling around the injured area, and his fingers were stiff. A medical staff member immediately stepped closer. Jimin pulled his hand back. "Just give me a minute." "You don't have a minute," Suga replied. "You have a choice." Jimin looked toward the stage again. The crowd erupted as another section of the performance began, And for a moment he seemed torn between the people waiting outside and the people standing beside him. Then his phone vibrated inside his jacket. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from someone whose name he did not recognize. The message contained only one sentence: "Please don't ignore what happened tonight." Jimin's expression changed. Suga noticed. "Who is that?" Jimin locked the screen. "Nobody." But it wasn't the first message. Earlier that afternoon, Jimin had received 2 others from the same number. He had ignored both because he assumed they were related to the concert organization. Now, after the fall, the timing felt different. He slipped the phone back into his pocket without explaining. Before Suga could ask again, a stage manager rushed into the corridor. "We need Jimin in 90 seconds. The medical staff member immediately shook her head. "Not until we assess him." The stage manager looked uncomfortable. "The next segment depends on him." Suga's jaw tightened. "Then change the segment." Jimin looked at him sharply. "No, Jimin. No, Hyung. The audience didn't come here to watch us change everything because I slipped." Suga stared at him. "You think this is about slipping?" Jimin didn't answer. He simply walked toward the dressing area, keeping his injured hand hidden beneath the sleeve of his jacket. But when he reached the mirror, he stopped. For the first time, he looked directly at the swelling. His fingers moved slightly. Pain flashed across his face. He quickly lowered his hand before anyone could see. Across the room, Jungkook had been quietly watching. He hadn't said a word since Jimin came backstage. Instead, he kept looking at the floor near the stage entrance. Finally, he approached the security staff and asked, "Did anyone move the equipment near the front platform?" The guard frowned. "Why?" Jungkook pointed toward a small section of the stage visible through the open curtain. "Because Jimin didn't just lose his balance." Suga heard him. He turned slowly. "What are you saying?" Jungkook hesitated before answering. There was something on the floor. The room went quiet. A staff member immediately checked the backstage monitor and rewound the footage. The image was grainy, but just before Jimin's fall, something small appeared near his landing point. It looked like a loose piece of equipment, or perhaps something that had fallen from the stage rigging. Nobody knew yet. Jimin watched the screen without speaking. Then his phone vibrated again. This time the message contained a photograph. His face went completely still. Suga noticed before anyone else. "Jimin, what did they send you?" Jimin slowly lowered the phone. "Nothing." But his voice had changed. The photograph was not of the stage. It was of a person standing outside the venue earlier that day, holding something in their hand. Jimin recognized the person immediately. He had seen them before the concert. Not backstage. Not among the staff. Somewhere else. And suddenly the fall no longer felt like an isolated accident. The question was no longer whether Jimin could return to the stage. It was why someone had warned him before the concert, and why he had chosen not to tell anyone. The backstage corridor had become a place where every sound seemed too loud. The bass from the arena traveled through the walls, security radios crackled in short bursts, and somewhere beyond the curtain, thousands of voices continued singing along to a song Jimin was supposed to be performing. But inside the medical room, nobody was listening to the concert anymore. The photograph on Jimin's phone remained open. Suga stood beside him, staring at the screen. "You know that person," he said. Jimin didn't answer immediately. "I've seen them before." "Where?" "Outside the venue." Suga's eyes narrowed. "When?" Jimin looked down at his injured hand. "Before soundcheck." That answer changed the atmosphere instantly. A staff member stepped closer. "Did they approach you?" Jimin shook his head. "No. They were just standing there." Then why did they send you a warning? Suga asked. Jimin finally looked at him. I don't know. But the hesitation in his voice made it clear that he had considered another possibility. The medical staff carefully examined his hand, asking him to move each finger one at a time. Jimin tried. His expression tightened. Stop, the medic said immediately. Don't force it. Suga turned away for a moment, pressing both hands against his face. He had spent years watching Jimin perform through exhaustion, pain, disappointment, and pressure. But there was something different about this. Jimin wasn't simply hiding an injury. He was hiding information. And Suga could feel the distance growing between what Jimin knew and what everyone else was being allowed to know. Tell me everything, Suga said. Jimin remained silent. Not because I'm angry, Suga continued. Because if somebody knew something could happen tonight, I need to understand why you kept it from us. Jimin swallowed. I thought it was nothing. You received messages before the concert. Yes. And you ignored them. Yes. Then you fell. Jimin's eyes closed for a second. I didn't know the two things were connected. Before Suga could respond, Jungkook entered the room carrying a small transparent evidence bag. Inside was a tiny metallic piece that looked like part of a stage fixture. They found this near the spot where Jimin fell, he said. Everyone looked at it. Was it part of the stage? The stage technician asked. Jungkook shook his head. That's the problem. It doesn't match the equipment used here. A security supervisor immediately asked where it had been found. Under the edge of the platform. The technician examined it carefully. It could have come from another piece of equipment. Could have, Suga repeated. His voice was quiet. But we don't know. The uncertainty was worse than an accusation. Nobody wanted to suggest that someone had deliberately caused the accident, but nobody could completely dismiss it either. Meanwhile, the concert was approaching another major transition. The stage manager returned with a difficult decision. We can remove Jimin from the next segment. Jimin immediately shook his head. No, Suga looked at him. You're not going back out there. I can still perform. Your hand is swelling. I can use my other hand. And if you fall again? Jimin's eyes hardened. Then I get back up again. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The argument wasn't really about the concert anymore. Jimin was afraid that stopping would disappoint everyone. Suga was afraid that continuing would make the injury worse. Finally, Jimin said something that made Suga go quiet. If I walk away now, everyone will remember the moment I fell. I don't want that to be the last thing they see. Suga stared at him. You think walking away means you're weak? Jimin didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. A few minutes later, the decision was made. Jimin would not perform the physically demanding section, but he would appear briefly during the transition so the audience would know he was safe. It was a compromise, but Jimin still looked dissatisfied. Then another problem appeared. The stage technician returned with the equipment report and discovered that one item used near the platform had been checked out under a staff identification number that didn't belong to anyone currently assigned to the concert. The room fell silent again. Security immediately began reviewing access records. The mysterious photograph suddenly seemed less random. Suga looked at Jimin. You need to tell us if you've seen that person anywhere else. Jimin stared at the phone in his hand. Then he remembered something he hadn't told anyone. Earlier that day, while walking through a restricted corridor, he had heard someone quietly say his name. He had turned around, but the hallway was empty. At the time, he had assumed it was a fan calling from a distance. Now, he wasn't so sure. There was something else, Jimin whispered. Suga waited. Someone called my name before soundcheck. Who? I don't know. What did they say? Jimin hesitated. They said, you shouldn't be here tonight. The words seemed to drain the air from the room. Security immediately moved toward the door. The stage manager locked the backstage entrance. Jungkook looked at the metallic piece again, then at Jimin's phone. And Suga realized the most frightening part wasn't that someone might have entered a restricted area. It was that Jimin had been receiving warnings all day, and had still walked onto that stage alone. But before anyone could question him further, the arena suddenly erupted with a roar unlike anything they had heard that night. The next performance had begun, and the crowd was calling Jimin's name. He looked toward the stage entrance. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about whether he could perform. He was thinking about whether someone out there was waiting for him to return. Jimin stood perfectly still as the crowd continued calling his name from beyond the curtain. The sound should have comforted him. Instead, for the first time that night, it made him listen more carefully. Thousands of voices were blending together, the concert lights were changing on schedule, crew members were moving quickly between equipment cases, and security was now quietly checking every person entering the restricted corridors. Everyone was focused on the possibility that something had gone wrong on the stage. Everyone except Jimin. His eyes returned to the photograph on his phone. Suga noticed it immediately. What are you looking at? Jimin enlarged the image with his uninjured hand. Wait. The photograph showed a person standing near the outer service entrance earlier that afternoon. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about them. Their head was lowered, their clothes were plain, and their face was partially hidden by the angle of the camera. But Jimin wasn't looking at the person's face. He was looking at their hand. Look at this, he said. Suga stepped closer. Jungkook leaned over from the other side. The person in the photograph was holding a small white object. Suga frowned. A phone? Jimin slowly shook his head. No, he remembered seeing the same object hours earlier. Not in the person's hand, but attached to a lanyard near the service corridor. I thought it was an access card, Jimin whispered. But it's folded. Jungkook looked confused. A note? Jimin nodded. Something about the memory returned with uncomfortable clarity. Before soundcheck, he had passed through the corridor with 2 staff members. Someone had brushed past him. He hadn't seen the person's face because he had been looking down at the floor while checking his costume. But he remembered the smell of rain on a jacket, the quick movement of a hand, and something white slipping toward the ground. He had assumed it was trash. Now he looked toward the pocket of his stage jacket hanging over a chair. My jacket, he said. A nearby staff member handed it to him. Jimin searched through the pockets carefully, using only his good hand. Nothing was inside the first pocket. Nothing in the second. Then his fingers touched a thin strip of paper caught beneath the inner lining. Wait. Suga took the jacket from him and carefully pulled the paper free. It was crumpled and slightly torn. There were only 6 handwritten words on it. Check the floor before you dance. Nobody spoke. The warning had not been sent after the fall. It had been given before Jimin ever stepped onto the stage. Jungkook stared at the note. Why didn't you see this? Jimin looked at the torn lining. Because I didn't know it was there. Suga's expression changed. The anger that had been building inside him suddenly gave way to something more complicated. Whoever had left the warning had not simply wanted to frighten Jimin. They had tried to prevent something. The messages, Suga said quietly. They weren't threatening you. Jimin looked at his phone again. The first message had said, please check the front platform. The second had said, don't ignore me. Jimin had assumed it was an obsessive stranger, someone trying to create panic on the day of the concert. But now the words carried a different meaning. Someone had known there was a problem. Find them, the security supervisor said into his radio. Several guards immediately began checking the external cameras and entry records. But Jimin wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had moved back to the stage footage. "Stop the video," he said. The technician paused the recording just seconds before the fall. Jimin stepped closer to the monitor. "Go back." The footage rewound. "There." He pointed to the edge of the frame. A crew member was walking near the platform with a large equipment case. Behind them, almost hidden by the camera angle, another figure appeared briefly. The same person from the photograph. But what caught Jimin's attention wasn't their movement. It was what they did next. The person bent down, reached toward the floor, then suddenly looked up toward the approaching camera operator. They stepped away quickly. "Zoom in," Jimin said. The image became distorted, but it was enough to see the person pointing towards something near the platform before disappearing from view. "They were trying to tell someone," Jimin whispered. Suga looked at him. "You think they're the one who found the object?" "I think they were trying to remove it." "Then why didn't they?" Jungkook asked. The answer came from the stage technician. "Because if they touched something inside the performance area without authorization, security would have stopped them." The room grew quiet. The person who had sent the warnings might not have been trying to cause harm at all. They might have been trying to prevent it without knowing how to reach Jimin directly. But there was still one question no one could answer: how had they known? Suga folded the note carefully and placed it on the table. Then he looked at Jimin's injured hand. "We're done guessing. You're getting proper treatment." Jimin shook his head. "Not yet. Jimin. We need to find that person. Security can do that." No, Jimin's voice was soft, but firm. "If they were trying to warn me, they might be scared. If security approaches them like they're a suspect, they could leave." Suga stared at him. "And what exactly do you want to do with that hand?" Jimin looked toward the service corridor. "Talk to them." Suga let out a breath and looked away. Jungkook watched the exchange silently, then suddenly reached into his pocket and placed something on the table. It was a small piece of black fabric. "I found this near the platform too," he said. "I didn't show anyone because I thought it was from a costume." The technician picked it up. Sewn onto the inside was part of a faded name tag. Only 3 letters remained visible. "Min." Jimin froze. Suga noticed. "You know that name?" Jimin didn't answer. His face had gone completely still, but his eyes had changed. It wasn't fear this time. It was recognition. A memory had surfaced, one he had not thought about in years. "Not the person," Jimin finally said. "But I know where I've seen that name." Before Suga could ask another question, a staff member appeared at the door. Security found someone outside the service in trance. Everyone turned. "The person from the photograph?" Suga asked. The staff member hesitated. "Yes. But there's a problem." "What problem?" Jimin asked. The staff member looked directly at him. "They say they came here because of you. And they refuse to explain anything unless Jimin agrees to see them himself." Suga immediately stepped forward. "Absolutely not." But Jimin was already reaching for his jacket. His injured hand trembled as he tried to pull the sleeve over it. Suga caught his wrist, not roughly, but firmly enough to stop him. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Jimin looked into his eyes and said, "Hyung, if that person tried to warn me, I need to know why." Suga's grip loosened. He looked at the note on the table, then at the arena beyond the curtain, where the music was still playing without Jimin. The concert had become the last thing on his mind. "You're not going alone," Suga said. Jimin nodded. Jungkook stepped beside them. "Neither are we." The decision was made without another word. Jimin, Suga, and Jungkook left the medical room and walked toward the locked service corridor, unaware that the person waiting on the other side was carrying a truth that would change the meaning of Jimin's fall. and forced Suga to confront something he had been hiding from Jimin himself. The service corridor was colder than the rest of the venue. The distant thunder of the concert had faded behind several heavy doors, leaving only the low hum of ventilation and the occasional crackle of a security radio. Jimin walked slowly beside Suga, his injured hand wrapped in a temporary support, while Jungkook remained a few steps behind with the security team. At the end of the corridor, a staff member quietly pointed toward a small waiting room. "They're inside," he said. Suga looked through the narrow glass panel in the door. A young man sat alone on a metal chair with both hands clasped between his knees. His jacket was damp from the rain outside. He looked exhausted rather than threatening. When the door opened, the young man immediately stood. His eyes went straight to Jimin's bandaged hand. His face collapsed with guilt. "I was too late," he whispered. Jimin stopped in front of him. "Who are you?" The young man swallowed. "My name is Min Jae-hyun." Jimin's eyes moved to the small piece of fabric Jungkook had found. The faded letters suddenly made sense. Min Jae-hyun looked down. "That was from my old work uniform." Suga stepped slightly in front of Jimin. "You worked here?" "Not here. At another venue." "Then how did you know about the stage?" Jae-hyun didn't answer. He reached slowly into his bag, but security immediately moved. Jimin raised his good hand. "It's okay." Jae-hyun pulled out a folded envelope and placed it on the table. Inside were photographs, handwritten notes, and a small maintenance diagram. Jimin looked at the diagram carefully. Suga's expression hardened. "Where did you get this?" Jae-hyun stared at the floor. "My father." The room became quiet. Jae-hyun explained that his father had spent years working as a maintenance contractor, moving from venue to venue and taking temporary jobs that nobody ever noticed. Months earlier, he had suffered an injury and lost most of his ability to work. Jae-hyun had taken small technical jobs to support his family while trying to finish a training program in stage engineering. He had once dreamed of working on concert productions permanently, but financial pressure had forced him to accept whatever work he could find. "I wasn't supposed to be involved with tonight's concert," he said. "But a few days ago, I saw a familiar part being transported with old equipment." Suga glanced at the photographs. "The metal piece." Jae-hyun nodded. "It was damaged." "Then why wasn't it reported?" Suga asked. Jae-hyun's voice became quieter. "Because I don't know who moved it. I only knew it didn't belong there." He had tried to contact the proper technical department, but the message had been lost among the preparations. When he realized the concert was already beginning, panic took over. He found a way to send warnings to Jimin after recognizing which performer would be using that section of the stage. "Why Jimin?" Suga asked. Jae-hyun looked embarrassed. "Because I knew he would listen." Jimin's expression softened. "You didn't know me." "No," Jae-hyun said. "But years ago, when I was still studying, I watched an interview where you talked about how small things matter when you're performing. You said you notice details because details can change everything." Jimin looked away. He seemed uncomfortable hearing his own words repeated by a stranger. "I thought if I could get your attention, maybe you'd ask someone to check." "You could have contacted security," Suga said. "I tried. They wouldn't believe me without proof." Jae-hyun's fingers tightened together. "And I was afraid." That simple admission changed the room more than any dramatic explanation could have. He wasn't a mysterious enemy. He was a frightened young man who had seen a problem and failed to convince the right people in time. Jimin looked at the photographs again. "The person on the stage video. That was you." Jae-hyun nodded. "I saw the object near the platform. I tried to reach it." "Why did you leave?" Jae-hyun lowered his head. "Security saw me." Jungkook, standing silently near the door, finally spoke. You ran. Yes. And then you started sending messages. Because I didn't know what else to do. Suga studied him for several seconds. The anger he had carried since Jimin's fall was still there, but it no longer had a clear target. The situation had been shaped by mistakes, fear, ignored warnings, and people assuming someone else would handle the problem. Nobody in the room looked innocent. Nobody looked completely guilty either. Then Jimin noticed something no one else had mentioned. Jae-hyun's right thumb was stained with blue ink. The same ink that appeared on the folded warning note. Jimin looked at his hands. They were shaking, not from fear, but from exhaustion. You wrote the note, Jimin said. Jae-hyun nodded. I put it in your jacket when you passed me in the corridor. Suga took a slow breath. You could have just stopped him. Jae-hyun's eyes filled, but he shook his head. I tried to get closer. Your security team was already moving everyone away. I didn't want to cause a scene. I thought the note would be enough. Jimin looked at him for a long moment. Then he asked, and the photograph? Jae-hyun's expression changed. That wasn't mine. Everyone became still. What do you mean? Jungkook asked. I didn't send that photograph. Jimin slowly lowered his phone. But the messages came from the same number. Jae-hyun shook his head. I only sent 2. Suga stepped closer. Which 2? Jae-hyun repeated them exactly. Please check the front platform. Don't ignore me. Jimin looked at his screen. There had been a third message after the fall. The photograph. And then another message that had appeared while he was backstage. Jae-hyun stared at it, confused. I didn't send that. Suddenly, the mystery they thought they had solved opened again. Someone else had access to the same situation. Someone had taken a photograph of Jae-hyun outside the venue and sent it to Jimin after the fall. Jae-hyun's warning had been real, but another person was watching. Security immediately began tracing the number, while Jungkook stepped outside to speak with the supervisor. Jimin remained in the room. He sat down slowly, and for the first time that night, the adrenaline seemed to leave his body. His shoulders dropped. Suga noticed. Your hand. Jimin didn't answer. Jimin. It hurts. The words were barely audible. Suga's face changed. He pulled a chair closer and sat beside him. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The waiting room was small, lit by one fluorescent light that flickered softly above them. Outside, the rain tapped against a narrow window. Jimin stared at his wrapped hand. I should have told you about the messages. Yes. I thought you'd tell me not to perform. I would have. Jimin let out a weak breath that almost became a laugh. That's why I didn't tell you. Suga looked at him. Do you know why that makes me angry? Jimin shook his head. Because you still think protecting yourself means disappointing me. Jimin finally met his eyes. Suga's voice lowered. You don't have to earn the right to stop. The words remained between them. Jimin's expression softened, but he looked away again. Sometimes I don't know how. Suga reached for the temporary bandage around Jimin's hand but stopped before touching it. Then let someone tell you. Jimin's eyes filled slowly. Hyung, you fell once tonight, Suga said. Don't make me watch you fall again just because you think standing up is the only thing people want from you. For the first time since the accident, Jimin allowed the silence to remain. He didn't reach for his microphone. He didn't ask about the concert. He simply sat there while Suga stayed beside him. Then Suga opened his own hand. Inside his palm was the small torn piece of fabric with the faded letters Mayen. I kept this because I thought it was proof of something dangerous, he said. But sometimes people look suspicious because they're afraid, not because they want to hurt you. Jimin looked at the fabric. And sometimes people stay quiet because they're afraid too. Suga understood immediately. The conversation was no longer only about Suga stared at the empty chair for several seconds before picking up the silver key. The label tied to it swung gently beneath his fingers, storage B12. Jimin stood beside him, pale from pain and exhaustion, while the concert continued somewhere beyond the maze of corridors. The applause sounded almost unreal now, as if it belonged to another world. "Where is he?" Jungkook asked as he returned to the room. No one answered immediately. Security had checked the nearby hallway, the service exit, and the adjacent loading area. Min Jae-hyun had not been seen leaving on any camera. The only thing he had left behind was the key. Suga looked at Jimin. "You're going to the hospital." Jimin shook his head. "Not yet. We had this conversation already. And I listened." "Then keep listening." Jimin glanced toward the key in Suga's hand. "He left that for us." Suga's expression hardened. "That doesn't mean you have to follow him. What if it's the reason he came here?" Suga stepped closer. "And what if someone wants you to walk straight into another problem?" Jimin didn't answer. His injured hand hung stiffly at his side. For the first time that night, he looked as if he might give up the argument. Then the lights in the waiting room flickered. Once. Twice. A low murmur came through the walls as something changed inside the arena. Jungkook immediately looked toward the ceiling. The concert's stopping. A staff member rushed down the corridor. "There's a technical problem. They've paused the stage sequence." The words brought everyone to attention. The timing was too close to ignore. Security ordered the backstage corridors cleared while the venue's technical team began checking the equipment again. Jimin's eyes moved to Suga. "B12, he said quietly. Suga looked at the key. He hated that part of him wanted answers too. "Jungkook," Suga said. "Stay with him." "Hyung," Jimin began. "No. We're not splitting up." They moved together through the lower service level, accompanied by 2 security officers and the venue's technical supervisor. The corridor leading to storage was darker, older, and far quieter than the polished backstage area above. Their footsteps echoed against concrete. Jimin walked between Suga and Jungkook, and every few steps, Suga glanced at his injured hand. Jimin noticed. "I'm still here," he whispered. "I know. Then stop looking at me like I'm about to disappear." Suga's face tightened. "You don't get to tell me what my face is doing tonight." Jungkook almost smiled, but the tension disappeared when they reached the door. B12. The silver key fit. Suga opened it slowly. The room inside was filled with old flight cases, unused stage panels, cables, broken lighting equipment, and shelves covered in dust. Nothing seemed unusual at first. The technical supervisor entered and immediately began examining the inventory. "This area isn't supposed to be accessible during a concert," he said. Jimin stepped inside and stopped. There was something placed carefully on top of a black equipment case. A folded piece of paper. Suga moved toward it first. Jimin read over his shoulder. "I didn't leave because I was afraid of security. I left because someone was looking for me." Below it was a second line. "The damaged part wasn't the only thing I found." Jungkook looked around the room. "What does that mean?" The answer came from behind a stack of equipment. A faint metallic sound. Everyone froze. Security moved first. One officer stepped around the cases and found a small maintenance box hidden behind them. Inside were several damaged fasteners, 2 access tags, and a compact audio recorder. The technical supervisor went pale. "These aren't supposed to be here." Suga turned toward him. "Whose are they?" The supervisor picked up one of the access tags. "I don't know." "Try harder." Before the man could answer, Jimin noticed something else. The audio recorder had a red light blinking. It was still on. Jungkook pressed the playback button. At first, there was only static. Then a voice. Two people were talking. The recording was unclear, filled with background noise, but one sentence came through. Move it before soundcheck. Nobody will notice. The room went completely silent. A second voice responded, and if someone gets hurt? There was a pause. Then the first voice said, it isn't supposed to happen. Jimin closed his eyes. Suga's hand moved instinctively toward his shoulder. The recording continued for a few more seconds before cutting off. There were no names. No clear identification. Only proof that someone had known the equipment was where it shouldn't have been. The technical supervisor immediately called the concert producer. Security sealed the storage room. The situation had gone beyond an accident, but Jimin seemed focused on something else. Listen again, he said. The second voice. Jungkook replayed it. Jimin stared at the recorder. That's not someone planning to hurt me. Suga looked at him. What? They're asking if someone could get hurt. Jimin pointed toward the recorder. They were scared. Suga didn't understand. Jimin, somebody still moved it. I know. But there were two people. The realization came slowly. One person had moved the damaged equipment. Another person had objected. Min Jae-hyun might have discovered the problem later, but perhaps he wasn't the only person who had tried to stop it. Suddenly, a security officer's radio came alive. We found Jae-hyun. Everyone turned. Where? Suga asked. Upper service stairs. He's injured. Jimin moved before anyone could stop him. Jimin. Suga called, but Jimin was already walking quickly toward the door. Pain flashed across his face, yet he didn't slow down. Jungkook followed, then Suga, whose anger had returned, not because Jimin was disobeying him, but because every new discovery seemed to pull Jimin toward another danger. They reached the upper stairwell just as paramedics arrived. Min Jae-hyun was sitting against the wall with a cut above his eyebrow. His breathing was uneven. When he saw Jimin, his expression changed. You're hurt, Jae-hyun whispered. Jimin almost laughed at the absurdity of the concern. So are you. I tried to stop them. The words came out quickly. Suga crouched beside him. Who? Jae-hyun shook his head. I didn't see their face clearly. Then why did you run? Jungkook asked. Jae-hyun looked toward the closed stairwell door. Because after I sent the messages, someone called me. Who? They knew my father's name. His voice broke. They said if I kept talking, my family would lose everything. Suga's expression changed immediately. The hidden conflict finally became visible. Jae-hyun hadn't disappeared because he wanted to make the mystery more dramatic. He had been terrified of consequences he couldn't afford. He had already been struggling to support his injured father and protect his family from financial collapse. Reporting what he had found could cost him work, reputation, and perhaps more. Why come back? Jimin asked. Jae-hyun looked directly at him. Because you fell. The stairwell became silent. I watched it happen on the monitor, Jae-hyun continued. I thought if I had shouted louder, if I had made a scene, if I had stopped you somehow, his voice disappeared. Jimin sat down beside him despite Suga's immediate protest. Hey. Jae-hyun looked at him. Jimin held his injured hand against his chest and spoke quietly. You warned me. But it wasn't enough. You still warned me. Jae-hyun's eyes filled. You got hurt. Jimin looked at his hand. Yes. Then how can you say it was enough? Jimin was silent for a moment. Because I know what it's like to think you have to carry everything alone. Suga looked down. The words struck him differently than anyone else. Jimin wasn't only speaking to Jae-hyun. He was admitting something about himself. The decision to stop the concert did not bring relief all at once. It brought movement. Doors opened. Radios filled the backstage corridors with instructions. Technical crews secured the stage section by section while venue staff guided the audience through the unexpected pause. On the giant screens, a simple message appeared asking everyone to remain calm. Jimin, Suga, and Jungkook were escorted away from the stage before anyone could ask Jimin to reconsider. This time, he did not look back. The medical team brought him directly to a treatment room, and the silence there felt heavier than the noise of the arena had been. When the specialist gently removed the temporary wrap, Jimin turned his face toward the wall. Suga noticed. "Does it hurt that much?" Jimin didn't answer. The doctor asked him to move his fingers. He tried once and stopped. "Don't force it," the doctor said. The examination continued quietly, with instructions Jimin barely seemed to hear. Suga stood near the door with his arms folded tightly across his chest, watching every movement. Jungkook remained beside him, unusually silent. After several minutes, the doctor finally looked up. "The good news is that we're dealing with an injury that can be treated. But he needs proper imaging and rest. No more performing tonight." Jimin closed his eyes. Suga let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. "You heard that," he said. Jimin opened one eye. "I heard." "Good. You don't have to sound happy about it." "I'm very happy about it." For the first time since the fall, a small smile appeared on Jimin's face. It lasted only a moment, but Suga saw it. The other members arrived gradually. RM came first, carrying the expression of someone trying to remain composed for everyone else. Jean entered behind him and looked directly at Jimin's hand before asking a single question. "How bad?" Jimin shrugged. The doctor answered for him. "Bad enough that he needs to stop using it." Jean looked at Jimin. "That means stop." Jimin sighed. "Why is everyone enjoying this part?" J-Hope, who had been standing quietly near the wall, suddenly looked away and wiped his eyes. Taeyoung noticed and put an arm around his shoulder without saying anything. The room was full of concern, but nobody wanted to turn it into a ceremony around Jimin's pain. They talked about practical things. Transportation. The medical center. Whether Jimin had eaten. How to inform the audience. What would happen to the remaining concert schedule? Yet beneath every conversation was the same feeling: things could have been worse. Much worse. Outside the treatment room, the investigation continued. The concert producer, venue management, and security officials reviewed access records and camera footage. The unauthorized equipment had been removed from the performance area, and the individual whose name appeared in the access records was being investigated. But the discovery created another consequence nobody had expected. Several staff members began coming forward with information they had initially dismissed as unimportant: an unfamiliar person in a restricted corridor, a maintenance request that had been delayed, an access badge that had been reported missing and then found in the wrong location. None of those details alone had seemed significant. Together, they revealed how easily small warnings could disappear when everyone assumed someone else was responsible. Suga listened to part of the discussion from the hallway, then walked away before it turned into something he couldn't control. He found Min Jae-hyun sitting in a separate medical area with a bandage above his eyebrow. Jae-hyun looked up immediately. "How is he?" "Alive," Suga said. Jae-hyun lowered his head. "I'm sorry." Suga stood in front of him. For a moment, Jae-hyun looked as though he expected another accusation. Instead, Suga placed a bottle of water on the chair beside him. "Your father," Suga said. Jae-hyun looked confused. "What about him?" "You said he's injured." Jae-hyun nodded slowly. "And you're supporting your family." Another nod. Suga's expression remained serious. That's why you were afraid to report this properly. Jae-hyun looked down. I was afraid nobody would believe me. And if they did, I was afraid they'd blame me for being involved. Fear doesn't make you wrong, Suga said. But it can make a bad situation worse when you're left alone with it. Jae-hyun looked up. Suga's voice softened slightly. Next time, make noise. Jae-hyun swallowed. Even if nobody listens? Especially then. It was not forgiveness in the simple sense. There was still an investigation. There were still questions about what Jae-hyun had seen, what he had removed 3 days earlier, and why the damaged part had remained near the performance area. But Suga understood something now. Jae-hyun had not needed someone to rescue him. He had needed someone to take his concerns seriously before fear became silence. A few minutes later, Jimin was wheeled toward the medical exit. He immediately spotted Jae-hyun in the hallway. You, Jimin said. Jae-hyun stood awkwardly. I thought you were going to the hospital. I am. Jimin looked at the bandage above Jae-hyun's eyebrow. You look worse than me. I don't think that's true. Don't argue with an injured person. Suga, walking behind them, shook his head. You're both impossible. Jimin stopped near Jae-hyun. His expression became more serious. Did you really remove something from the stage 3 days ago? Jae-hyun looked toward security. Yes. What was it? Jae-hyun hesitated. Then he reached into his pocket and removed a small object wrapped in tissue. It was a cracked metal fastener. This. Jimin looked at it. Why keep it? I thought it might be evidence. Of what? Jae-hyun's answer was quiet. That someone had been using old parts where they shouldn't have been. Suga stepped closer. Why didn't you give it to security? Jae-hyun looked ashamed. I tried to report it through a supervisor. He told me I was overreacting. That was the consequence nobody in the room could ignore. Jae-hyun had not stayed silent because he had never spoken. He had spoken once and been dismissed. After that, every warning became more desperate and less organized. The anonymous messages. The hidden note. The attempt to reach the platform. The decision to run. Jimin looked at the cracked fastener for a long moment. Then he said, give it to them now. Jae-hyun nodded. Suga watched Jimin carefully. Something had changed in him since they had sat together in the waiting room. He was no longer trying to prove he could continue. He was paying attention to what happened when someone stopped. At the medical center, the members waited while Jimin underwent further examination. The long hours that followed were quieter than anyone expected. Jean ordered food nobody seemed hungry enough to eat. RM made calls about the postponed schedule. J-Hope sat near the window, occasionally checking messages from concerned people. Tae-young kept asking Jimin whether he wanted water, a blanket, or his phone, even after Jimin had answered no 3 times. Jungkook barely left the waiting area. When Jimin finally returned with a more secure brace around his hand, everyone stood at once. Sit down, Jimin said. You're making this weird. Nobody sat. The doctor explained that Jimin would need time to recover and follow a treatment plan. The injury had to be taken seriously. Jimin listened this time without arguing. Suga stood beside him with both hands in his pockets. When the doctor left, Jimin turned toward the group. I'm sorry. RM immediately shook his head. No, I should have told you about the messages. Yes, Suga said. Everyone looked at him. Jimin gave him a tired look. You too? Suga stepped forward. You should have told us. But I should have noticed you were afraid before I got angry that you were hiding it. Jimin's expression softened. Suga looked at the floor for a second before continuing. I spent the whole night trying to protect you from making the wrong decision. I didn't ask why you felt like you had to make it alone. The room fell quiet. Jimin didn't respond immediately. The practice room looked almost exactly the same, but Jimin no longer did. Morning light stretched across the wooden floor, catching the edges of the mirrors and the quiet dust floating in the air. A speaker played softly in the corner while Jimin stood in the center of the room with both hands relaxed at his sides. There was no audience, no countdown, no cameras waiting for him to get the movement right on the first attempt. He lifted one arm, paused, then moved carefully into the opening position of a routine he had avoided for weeks. The injury had healed, though recovery had not been simple. There had been physical therapy, long periods of frustration, days when even ordinary movements reminded him that his body had limits he could not negotiate with. At first, he had hated the slowness of it. He wanted a clear date when everything would return to normal. Instead, he had learned that healing rarely worked that way. Some mornings he felt strong. Other mornings, a small stiffness in his hand made him stop and breathe before continuing. But the biggest change was not in his hand. It was in what he did when something hurt. The old Jimin would have looked around first, wondering whether anyone needed him to keep going. This time, he simply stopped. Suga, sitting near the wall with a cup of coffee, noticed immediately. "Problem?" he asked. Jimin flexed his fingers once. "No. Just checking." Suga raised an eyebrow. "Checking?" Jimin nodded. "Checking the floor before I dance." For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Suga looked down and smiled. The sentence had become an inside reminder between them, but it carried a history neither of them forgot. Jimin walked to the side of the room and picked up a small box from the floor. Inside were two objects he had kept since that night, the crumpled handwritten warning and the faded piece of black fabric with the letters Min. Suga glanced at them. "You still carry those around?" "Not everywhere." "That's worse somehow." Jimin laughed. "They're reminders." "Of what?" Jimin closed the box. "That sometimes the person trying to help doesn't know how to ask." Suga's smile disappeared slightly. "And?" Jimin looked at him. "That sometimes the person who needs help doesn't know how to accept it." Suga looked away. 6 months had given them time to talk about things that had once remained hidden behind schedules and jokes. Not every conversation had been easy. Jimin had admitted that he often felt responsible for keeping the atmosphere around him light, even when he was struggling. Suga had admitted that his instinct to protect people could sometimes sound like anger before he had time to explain what he was afraid of. They had not transformed overnight. Suga still became quiet when worried. Jimin still sometimes said he was fine too quickly. But now the people around them noticed. And, more importantly, they allowed themselves to notice each other. The postponed concert had eventually been rescheduled. Before returning to the stage, the entire production underwent a stricter safety review. Technical procedures were changed. Reporting systems were made clearer. Staff members were encouraged to raise concerns without waiting for a perfect chain of approval. No one publicly treated one night as the single reason for every improvement. The changes came from a long list of lessons, investigations, and conversations. But among the crew, one phrase became quietly familiar: "If something feels wrong, say it early." The words had no dramatic ceremony attached to them. They appeared in meetings, in checklists, and in conversations between technicians before rehearsals. Sometimes a junior crew member asked a question that might once have been dismissed as unnecessary. Now someone answered. Sometimes a piece of equipment was checked twice. Sometimes a rehearsal paused for 10 minutes because one person had noticed something small. Those pauses cost time. They also gave people permission to speak. Min Jae-hyun was not standing on a concert stage 6 months later. His life had not suddenly become easy because he had tried to do the right thing. The investigation had cleared him of responsibility for the accident, but the weeks afterward had been difficult. He had lost temporary work while the situation was being examined. His father still needed treatment. Their apartment was still small. Bills still arrived. But Jae-hyun had made one decision he might not have made before that night. He returned to his training program in stage engineering. The first day back, he stood outside the classroom for nearly 10 minutes before entering. He had imagined everyone would know what had happened. He had imagined questions, whispers, or judgment. Instead, one of his instructors looked at him and said, "We saved your place." Jae-hyun sat down. Nothing about the sentence was extraordinary, but he remembered it for a long time. Months later, he was assigned to help inspect safety systems for a small community performance. The venue was nowhere near the size of the arena where Jimin had fallen. The stage was narrow, the budget was limited, and the performers were local students. During setup, Jae-hyun noticed a loose connection beneath one of the lighting panels. A younger technician glanced at it and said, "It's probably fine for one night." Jae-hyun froze. The old version of himself might have hesitated. He might have worried about sounding difficult. He might have wondered whether he understood the problem well enough to speak. Instead, he turned off the power and said, "Then let's prove that before we use it." The room became quiet. It took 20 minutes to inspect and replace the connection. The performance started late. Nobody complained. When the lights finally came on, Jae-hyun stood at the back of the room and watched children step onto the stage safely. He didn't feel heroic. He felt tired. But for the first time in months, the memory of Jimin's fall did not return as guilt. It returned as a choice. Across the city, another choice was being made. Jimin had agreed to visit a small rehearsal project for young performers who had been struggling with confidence after injuries, setbacks, and long breaks from training. It was not a public event. There were no major cameras, no large press line, and no need for a polished speech. Suga came with him quietly and stood near the back while Jimin watched the group rehearse. One young dancer stopped halfway through a movement and lowered her arm. "Sorry," she said automatically. "My wrist." The instructor immediately stepped toward her, but Jimin raised his hand gently. "Don't apologize." The girl looked confused. Jimin smiled. "Tell them what hurts." She nodded slowly. The instructor asked questions. The music stopped. Someone brought an ice pack. The rehearsal continued later with changes to the routine. Suga watched the entire scene without saying anything. As they left, Jimin glanced at him. "What?" Suga shook his head. "Nothing." "You're looking at me." "I'm allowed." "No, you're judging me." "I'm thinking." "That's worse." Suga laughed quietly. Then he said, 6 months ago, you would have told her to push through." Jimin considered that. "Maybe." "And now?" Jimin looked back through the glass door at the young dancer sitting with the instructor. "Now I think stopping can be part of the work." Suga nodded. It was one of the simplest things Jimin had said all day, but Suga carried it with him. The unanswered message from the night of the concert had eventually been traced, not to another mysterious attacker, but to a former contract worker who had accessed information during the confusion and anonymously forwarded material connected to the investigation. The person had been identified, questioned, and the remaining uncertainty was resolved through official procedures. There had been no hidden mastermind and no dramatic confrontation. The truth was more ordinary and, in some ways, more disturbing. Confusion had allowed multiple people to act without understanding the full picture. Jae-hyun's warnings had become mixed with someone else's attempt to expose what they believed had happened. The result was chaos. Once the full investigation was complete, responsibility was distributed across real failures, unauthorized access, ignored maintenance concerns, weak communication, and decisions made by people who assumed someone else would intervene. For Jimin, the answer brought closure, but not the kind that erased memory. Some questions could be answered. Others had to become lessons. The first major concert after his recovery arrived months later. Backstage, the atmosphere was different. Long after the arena had emptied and the final work lights had gone out, the story of that night remained in the smallest things. In a hand that had learned patience during recovery. In a man who had once been too afraid to speak, then learned that being dismissed once did not mean his voice had no value. In a friend who discovered that anger could sometimes be fear with nowhere else to go. And in the quiet understanding between people who had spent years believing they needed to be strong for one another, only to realize that true strength sometimes begins when we finally admit that we cannot carry everything alone. Jimin's fall lasted only seconds. The consequences lasted much longer. Not because one accident magically transformed every life around it, but because it forced people to pause long enough to see what had been there all along. The missed warning. The unanswered message. The tired expression hidden behind a smile. The person standing at the edge of a room, unsure whether they had the right to speak. The friend whose concern sounded like anger because fear had already taken hold of their voice. None of those things looked important at first. But human lives are often changed by details we almost ignore. Jae-hyun did not become fearless. There were still moments when he hesitated before speaking. There were still bills on the table at home, difficult days with his father, and an uncertain future that no one could solve for him. But now, when something felt wrong, he remembered the cost of assuming silence was safer. He had learned that courage was not always a dramatic decision made in front of a crowd. Sometimes it was stopping a rehearsal. Sometimes it was asking someone to check a piece of equipment again. Sometimes it was admitting, I don't know if this is important, but I think someone should look. And sometimes that was enough to prevent another person from standing alone at the edge of a mistake. For Jimin, the memory remained more personal. Recovery had given him time he never wanted and needed more than he expected. Time without performing. Time without solving every problem immediately. Time to notice how often his first instinct had been to reassure everyone else before asking himself what he actually felt. He had spent years understanding the responsibility that came with being watched, with knowing that a smile could travel farther than a private worry. But the night he fell taught him something the applause never could. People who care about you are not always asking you to be perfect. Sometimes they are waiting for permission to care for you honestly. And that permission can begin with two simple words, I'm scared. Suga remembered the night differently. He remembered the sound of Jimin hitting the stage more clearly than he wanted to. He remembered the moment he saw the swelling in Jimin's hand. He remembered every time Jimin had tried to say he was fine, and every time Suga had wanted to force the truth out of him because he was terrified of what the truth might be. But with time, he understood something uncomfortable about himself. Protecting someone did not always mean making their decisions for them. Sometimes the person you love most does not need you to become stronger than their fear. Sometimes they need you to sit beside them inside it. To ask instead of accuse. To listen before demanding an explanation. To stay when there is nothing left to fix. That was why the quiet moments after the accident mattered as much as the fall itself. The hospital waiting room. The empty practice studio. The dark stage after everyone had gone home. Those were the places where nobody had to perform. Where tears were not part of a scene. Where silence did not mean failure. Where two people could sit beside each other and finally understand that concern did not have to be hidden behind control, and pain did not have to be hidden behind a smile. Jungkook carried his own memory of that night. He had watched Jimin return to the stage even after everything had gone wrong. He had seen Suga break down in front of thousands of people. And he had understood, perhaps more clearly than before, that love and friendship are not always shown through perfect words. Sometimes they appear in the person who notices the smallest detail on a stage. The one who stays near the door without being asked. The one who follows you into a difficult conversation. The one who says, I was scared, because pretending otherwise would create even more distance. The others carried the night with them too. RM remembered the responsibility of making calm decisions when everyone else was afraid. Jean remembered that humor could bring warmth into a room, but that sometimes the kindest thing was simply to stop joking and listen. J-Hope remembered the helplessness of watching someone he loved in pain and the relief of realizing that presence could still matter when there was nothing else to do. Tae-young remembered the silence that fell over the arena, when thousands of people stopped reacting as an audience and began listening as human beings. None of them left that night with the same lesson. Perhaps that was why it stayed with them. One event can mean different things to different people, because every person arrives carrying a different fear. The audience remembered their own version too. Some remembered the sudden darkness. Some remembered the uncertainty when the concert stopped. Some remembered Jimin walking back onto the stage with his hand injured. Some remembered Jungkook standing close beside him. But for many, the image that remained was Suga trying to hold himself together and failing. Not because tears made him weak, but because they revealed what words could not carry at that moment. A person can spend years being seen as composed, strong, talented, successful, and still be completely powerless when someone they care about is hurt. There was something strangely human in that. The crowd did not need an explanation for every tear. They simply understood that, for a moment, the people on stage were no longer protected by distance. They were worried friends standing under bright lights, trying to find the right thing to do. Months later, the phrase "check the floor before you dance" still existed, folded carefully inside a small box. To anyone else, it was just a warning written on a piece of paper. To Jimin, it had become a reminder to pay attention before moving forward. To Suga, it meant noticing what people were too afraid to say. To Jae-hyun, it meant speaking before fear had the chance to become silence. The meaning was never fixed, because people changed the moment they carried it into their own lives. That may have been the true legacy of the night. Not the accident. Not the investigation. Not the headlines people might have written afterward. The legacy was the pause. A moment when everyone was forced to stop moving and ask what they had failed to see while rushing forward. Human beings are often taught to admire endurance. Keep going. Don't complain. Be professional. Don't disappoint anyone. Stand back up quickly so nobody has time to worry. But there is another kind of courage that receives far less applause. The courage to stop before you break. The courage to tell someone that you don't understand what is happening. The courage to believe a frightened person even when their warning arrives imperfectly. The courage to say, "I need help," without knowing exactly what help will look like. And the courage to remain beside someone after you realize you cannot solve everything for them. Jimin eventually returned to the stage. His hand healed. The music continued. New concerts began, new cities filled with lights, and new memories were created. But returning did not mean forgetting. It meant carrying the lesson forward without allowing the past to become a cage. Suga still watched him from the side of the stage sometimes. Jimin still caught him doing it. They still argued about whether everything was fine. They still understood each other imperfectly, because that was what real relationships were like. Not a final moment of complete understanding, but an ongoing decision to keep learning how to care for one another better. And perhaps that is what made the story matter in the end. No one was saved by a miracle. No single conversation repaired every wound. The injured hand did not heal because someone loved Jimin enough. Jae-hyun's family problems did not disappear because he finally found his courage. Suga did not suddenly become unafraid of losing the people he cared about. Life continued to demand difficult choices. Recovery required time. Trust required action. Fear returned in new forms. But now, when something felt wrong, there was a greater chance that someone would notice. Someone would ask. Someone would answer honestly. And someone would stay. Perhaps that is all empathy really asks of us. Not that we become heroes in every difficult moment, but that we refuse to look away too quickly. That when a person beside us says, "I'm fine," we learn to hear the pause after the words. That when someone gives a warning badly, nervously, or imperfectly, we don't dismiss the message simply because it was not delivered